All right, a new educational chess game. I have black. My opponent starts with the pawn to e4, and I'm going to play. c6, my favorite defense, the Caro-Kann. He plays knight to c3, so I play d5. c6 was there to support the d5 push, and he plays knight to f3. I take his pawn on e4, and now I'm going to play knight to f6, even though I know that the capture will give me doubled pawns. Why am I doing this? I'm thinking that after the capture, I'll recapture with the pawn from e7 to f6. That will speed up the development of the bishop. And afterwards, I'll look to do a kingside castling with 4 pawns for protection instead of just 3. So in the end, the doubled pawns will actually strengthen the protection of my king. But my opponent plays queen to e2. Now there's a trap here that you absolutely must not fall into. For example, trying to play knight to d7, because he would play knight to d6, checkmate. The pawn on e7 is pinned. So I must not play knight to d7. I'm going to take his knight first, then I'll play knight to d7 to bring it to f6. But you see, I shouldn't have played knight to d7 right away. My opponent plays bishop c4, knight to f6. We push back his queen. He has good development for now, but I can play the pawn to d6 and be very solid. Note that bishop to g4 is tempting here to do the pin. We feel like doing it, but I think it doesn't work. I'm worried about bishop takes on f7, check, king takes, and knight to e5, check. My king has to move. The knight will take the bishop with the support of the queen. And after bishop to g4, there could even be knight e5, by the way, because if I take his queen, there's another mate. Bishop takes on f7 mate. But the problem for me is that playing e6 traps my bishop. So instead, I'll play this bishop to f5. I realize that on g4, I couldn't go there, even if it would have been a pin. So I stop at f5. A quick bathroom break on this square. I'll play e6 next and maybe later on. In the game, I'll come to g4. My opponent plays knight to e5. And you see he's threatening mate. It's serious. Bishop takes on f7 mate. So e6 to free the bishop from the black square. Fortunately for me, his threat was a one-move threat. But it's very easy to parry, of course. So I don't know if it was really that good for him to play it. The pawn on c2 is hanging. The problem is he could play d3 and my bishop would end up trapped. He can still come back to a4 though. But after b3, I see it coming. b5, bishop takes on b5, pawn takes, and queen takes on b5. Check. So it's a trap, you see. Capturing the pawn on c2 is a trap. There are quite a few traps in this opening, you see. There are a lot of moves you need to defuse. He castles kingside, still with his bishop takes on c2 trap, but I don't want to fall for it. And I'm going to develop my bishop. Bishop to d6, he could play d4, maybe bishop e7, so that on d4 I can take. Even though I know it could give him some development. He can play rook to d1, everything is protected on his side, the rook is on the file. All right, I'm going to play bishop e7, let's see. Let's see if he's going to push the pawn d4, do this pawn gambit, this pawn sacrifice, or if he'll play more cautiously with d3 or pawn c3, followed by pawn d4. As for me, in any case, I'm really eager to do kingside castling. So I don't have any advantage in the position, but my opening is solid. There are no weaknesses either. I think we're close to equality. Of course, his knight on e5, it's unpleasant to have it in my territory like that, centralized and inside my territory. But for now, it's not coordinating with the other pieces. A knight like that positioned on the last square of a semi-open file, that is a half-open file, is called an outpost. And now he plays c3. He weakens the d3 square, but unfortunately, I can't go there. So if it weren't for the knight and the bishop, I would play bishop to d3, protected by my queen. But obviously, there's the bishop and the knight, so it's impossible. He's going to play d4 to solidify, you see. So as soon as I kingside castling, he plays d4. What could I play? I can't easily push b5 because there could be her, and p6 attacking the queen and my bishop. If I try to stop the d4 push with c5, I'm going to get hit by bishops. b5 check. The truth is, I think I can't do anything against his push to d4. So let's do kingside castling. We'll just develop and see how the game unfolds. He must be a little better in terms of pawn structure, since he still has a central presence, with the pawn on d4 in the center and the knight on e5 on the outpost. But it's not that easy for him to make use of it. At least that's what I think. Now, what could my plan be? If my plan is simply to provoke piece exchanges, that's a bit lacking, honestly. You see, I could play kd7 to offer the exchange of knights, for example. Now I can play c5 to attack his center. Maybe he'll slide the rook to d1 to line up the rook with the queen. I'm really tempted to play c5 anyway. I'm going to do it. We'll try to weaken his center a bit, try to create an isolated pawn. You see, if he captures, and if he recaptures with the pawn, he'll have what's called an isolated pawn, meaning a pawn that can't be defended by another pawn. But anyway, he can take, in which case I'll recapture on c5. And then we'll have different majorities. He'll have a pawn majority on the queen side, 3 pawns against 2, whereas I'll have a pawn majority on the other side. 4 pawns here against 3. That will be the only real difference in the position. The only lasting difference, because obviously the pieces are not placed in the same spots. But the structural differences are there to stay, because if a pawn changes files, it can't move itself back to the neighboring file. He plays bishop to e3, connects his rooks, protects the pawn on d4. That's well played. Now he could even take on c5. I'm looking here at queen c7, so that if he takes on c5, I take the knight. And after queen c7, I protect the pawn c5. And sometimes there can be problems with his bishop, although in reality his bishop is well protected. If I take on d4, he'll recapture with the bishop. I think that's what's going to happen. So I can play queen c7, connecting my rooks as well. I don't see anything better for now. So we've both completed our respective developments. You see the kings have castled, the minor pieces are out, the rooks are connected. Now there's this battle of pieces where, in reality, neither he nor I really have any weaknesses, any pieces hanging or unprotected. It's a very solid opening. Maybe I'll continue by putting my rooks on d8 or c8, mobilize my pawns a bit, maybe push the queen with a6, b5. Unfortunately, I don't have a very clear, very straightforward plan here, you see. Interesting game, my opponent is playing seriously. He's also taking his time, because sometimes when playing online, even with somewhat slow time controls like this one, 15 minutes plus a 10-second increment per move, there can be players who play the opening very quickly. Who, in the end, make blunders. So rook d1 has been played. I'm going to play a rook on d8. I'm not really sure which one. Normally, you would rather put the rook f on d8 to leave the a-rook free to go to c8. But moving the rook f8 weakens the defense of f7. I'm going to put the rook f8 on d8, hoping there won't be any problems on f7. My opponent plays h3. Maybe he's planning to play g4 to push back my bishop, and even g5 to push back my knight. However, this kind of pawn push can weaken his castling. I'm going to play rook c8. I'm putting the rooks on the d and c files, since those are the files most likely to open up completely. Now, what can I do? There's still this idea of pushing a6, then b5. Or I could try to challenge his bishop on the dark square by playing knight to d5. Will he leave it hanging, or will he move it? Or maybe he'll even exchange his bishop on the dark square for the knight on d5. That move could lead to very different piece changes. But now he plays b3. So let's see what happens, because by playing b3, he weakens the pawn on c3. And so when I play knight d5, I'm attacking the pawn on c3. So there, either he will go bishop, takes knight, or he will play bishop d2 to protect. There. Will certainly be ideas like that. But after knight to d5, bishop takes. Rook takes, he'll play c4 to attack my rook. I can't take on d4. Otherwise, I have moves like queen to a5, which will put pressure on c3, but also on a2. Shall we play? Queen to f5. If I play queen to a5, he can take on c5. If bishop takes, there might be the fork on b4, perhaps. All right, I'll play a6. It's not necessarily the optimal move, but it allows me to threaten, for example, b5. He'll be forced to come back to d3. That will likely provoke an exchange of the light-squared bishops, certainly. He plays a4 precisely to fight against this b5 push. I need to find a plan, because right now I don't have one. You see, after queen to a5, what bothers me is the capture on c5. I can't recapture with the bishop. At least I think so, because of the b4 push. I'd have to see, because the queen could come back to c7 to attack his knight. Knight to d5, maybe he'll play bishop to d2, but after the capture, he'll have to recapture with the pawn, and we'll create an isolated pawn for him. Why not? Let's play. Knight to d5. We'll see how he solves the problem of defending the pawn on c3, which he himself weakened when he played the pawn from b2 to b3. He left me with this weakness, not easily accessible. It's not easy to go and attack it, but earlier I tried with queen to a5, and I found that it didn't really work. Now I'm trying with knight to d5. And as you can see, we're already at the 17th move of the game. We've both spent quite a bit of time thinking, and there haven't been many exchanges. Just an exchange of knight and an exchange of pawn. A knight and a pawn on each side. So the position is still relatively closed. It could explode and open up all of a sudden, but it's still quite positional. It's interesting, the collaboration between the knight attacking the black squares in its own camp and the bishop controlling the white squares. That takes away some defensive squares from him. He plays queen to h5. That's a move. Honestly, I wasn't expecting that. It's putting pressure on f7. That's why I can't just go and take the pawn on c3 so easily. So I can move the bishop back to g6 to defend f7 and attack his queen. What will he do then? Knight takes, I can recapture with the pawn, attack his queen. The pawn on c3 will still be in danger. I don't know how he's going to defend it. So bishop to g6 if knight takes. I recapture with the pawn on h1. I recapture with the pawn from the edge towards the center so it controls the most squares, and recapture with the pawn from f7 to g6. The downside is that it weakens the defense of the pawn on e6, which will become an isolated pawn, by the way. So to keep the coherence of my pawn structure, king to king takes the bishop, I recapture with the h-pawn on g6. And I have this group of 4 pawns that defends my king fairly well. And so he wanted to counterattack elsewhere, but at the expense of his pawn on c3. You see, I recapture, I attack his queen, his pawn on c3 is under attack. He doesn't have a defensive retreat with the queen to defend c3, so maybe he'll find an attack somewhere else, but I don't see it. Here, his queen doesn't have an amazing square. Some might say all this just for a pawn, but it's not simply about winning a pawn. Winning the pawn on c3 will weaken d4, will open up the position, pieces will be exchanged, and if I have one more pawn, I'll simply have better endgames to create a new queen. So it's a considerable advantage. You can absolutely sacrifice pawns in chess, that's what's called gambits, but you need to have compensation, better development, a better center, or attacking possibilities against the king. But here, he actually has nothing. He's going to lose the pawn on c3, and he has no compensation at all. There you go. He goes back to f3. He didn't initially want to passively defend the pawn on c3. He tried to launch a counterattack, but counterattacks don't always pay off. They say the best defense is a good offense. But the attack still needs to be serious. But here, I could easily neutralize it. With kep c3, I attack his rook. Maybe he'll put it on c1 to line it up with my queen. But anyway, I came here to take the pawn on c3. He plays bishop to f4, attacking my queen and revealing an attack on my knight, but queen to a5 to defend. He's going to play bishop to d2 to pin, but there will be the capture on d4 to defend again. So queen to a5. And when I capture on d4, I win another pawn, and I can play bishop to f6 or bishop to b4 to defend the knight again. So there you go. He plays bishop d2, I capture on d4. So now I have 2 more pawns. So it's true that the pawn on b7 is exposed, but his rook is under attack, so I can't take it. The rook, I'm pinned, that's true. So maybe he'll play queen to b7 and attack my bishop here. And bishop to b4 eventually to protect my knight and unpin myself. And he can take the pawn on a6, I hadn't seen that. And he's going to completely wipe out my pawns on the queen side. He'll have 2 more pawns on the queen side, and I'll have 2 extra pawns as well. He played rook to c1. If it weren't for his queen, I could play knight with double check. Even if the bishop takes, I could then take the bishop on d2. If I play bishop to a3, he can play rook to c2. What does that lead to? I don't know. To avoid leaving the pawn on b7 hanging, I can play b5. Maybe that's what I'll do, actually. I'm going to play pawn to b5. I don't leave my weakness hanging, and I attack his bishop. And at the same time, if his bishop is no longer there, my rook will help defend the knight. But in the analysis, we'll have to take a look. The sequence with queen takes on b7. I discovered it during the game, so I didn't have time to analyze what I would have done. It'll be a chance to see if it was better for white to play. Queen takes b7 rather than rook c1. And what should I have done to counter that? So I no longer have bishops on a white square, so I need to be very careful about the conflict that could arise on the white squares. That's why I played b5, by the way, so as not to let the pawn on b7 get taken, and then the pawn on a6. And you see, fortunately, I have the pawn on e6. This structure of pawns on f7, e6, and g6, I don't move it. I keep it on a white square to protect my king from all the attacks by his bishop on a white square. These three pawns never move. And I have to try to create conflict on the black squares, but it's not easy because my knight is currently pinned and my bishop doesn't have a target. Maybe I'll have to play bishop. Before, move the knight to exchange the bishops on the black squares, break up his pair of bishops, take away his bishop on the black squares, which is really bothering me at the moment, I have to admit. So he takes on c3, I recapture with the pawn. And I get this passed pawn. If the bishop leaves, the rook and the queen protect, and I have a nice passed pawn. And a better protected king because I have 4 pawns for protection against 3. So he plays bishop to e2. I can even protect with b4 again. I can't really go after the pawn on a4 because I lose c3. And then I have to watch out for rook to a1 and counterattacks on a6 with his bishop. I'm checking what happens. Rook to d2. Why rook to d2? It could be interesting to attack his bishop here and then have threats with bishop to c5 to try to put pressure on the pawn on f2. But rook to d2, you have to calculate. Queen to b7, he attacks my rook and my bishop as well. I'm still considering rook to d2 once again, because after queen to b7, I have queen to c7, which can be played. Queen takes, rook takes, and his bishop is attacked. I'm going to go to d2. Put pressure on his bishop and look for pressure on the pawn at f2, since it's one of the only targets I can have on a black square, with my bishop on a black square. What can I do on the black square? Try to set up a battery of attack along this diagonal with bishop and queen, but he could play 3 to block. So the idea is to put pressure on the pawn at f2. He plays queen to b7 as expected. Here I was looking at queen to c7. I'm thinking he can't take on a6 because of the bishop. I can play rook c7 as well. He might play a check on a8, but then there's rook to d8. And I push him back. Also the attack from his queen. But I like it. Queen to c7, queen takes, rook takes. He moves his bishop. And I have 2 extra pawns. So it's not easy to convert this endgame, but I think I'm much better. So I'm going to play queen to c7. I'm suggesting to trade. Queen, I have 2 extra pawns. Normally, he'll want to keep the queens to try to find some counterplay. Or else he'll try to exchange the queens and think that we're in a bishop endgame with opposite colors, and that he'll try to find a blockade on a white square. Blockade of my pawns on a white square. Since I have a bishop on black square, it would be hard for me to break through. Maybe the situation, but I think it's winning for me. Endgames with opposite colored bishop, even with an extra pawn, often aren't won. But with 2 extra pawns, there's a good chance to win, especially since the rooks are still on the board. So he protects his queen with the bishop. That's interesting because if I take, he recaptures with the bishop the fork between the rook and the pawn on a 6. That's well played. All right, I'll take the pawn on a4. And maybe play a5 afterwards to remove the weakness on the white square. Note that if I play bishop to c5, he can't take the pawn on c3 because of bishop f2. Check. That could be interesting. But well, the pawn on a6 is in danger, so I'll put it on a5. I still have those 2 extra pawns. And we're in this opposite colored bishop position. So I absolutely have to find threats on the black square. And I have to play with my passed pawn to have a chance to make a queen. Or in any case, to use this pawn as a decoy, sometimes to deflect and be able to win elsewhere. It's not easy either to make a queen with this pawn, because for now the c1 square, he controls it well. But it's true that it's a black square. So my bishop of square, black will eventually be able to dislodge the piece that controls the c1 square. By the way, with bishop g5 or bishop 3, we'll be able to dislodge the rook very quickly. I think that's what I need to do in the end. I was looking to attack f2, but I think I'll have to play c2 and dislodge the rook and promote the pawn. So he doesn't really have a threat with queen b5. So I always have this bishop move. c5, the pressure on f2, on rook takes c3, bishop takes f2, check, and I can pick up his rook on c3. But I have bishop a3 to divert his rook. From the control of the square of promotion, and then play c2, c1 afterwards, actually. Bishop a3, rook a1, c2. If he plays rook takes, bishop, I play queen. He doesn't have any threats, I don't see any. So bishop a3, he plays rook a1 as expected. So already I have bishop b2, which could be interesting. But I look at pawn c2. What is he going to do? How is he going to control the square of promotion? All right, I push pawn c2. So I have unprotected pieces, the bishop on a3, the rook on d2, so I have to be careful. But here the threat of promotion is terrible. And you see this pawn c, what an adventure. It's the pawn c3 that I won from my opponent. When he played pawn b3, I told you that it had weakened the pawn c3. I ended up winning this pawn c3 and my own pawn, c. Finally advances, I create this passed pawn that has a square of promotion, and in the end, it's the c file that will decide everything. For me, there are two critical moments in the game. There's the critical moment when he doesn't defend c3, and he moves to h5 with his queen to attack f7. But it's a counter-attack that doesn't work. And in the end, he's going to lose c3. And the other critical moment is when he could have entered b7 with his queen. And there it was necessary to calculate what that would lead to. And we'll look at it in the analysis. Maybe it doesn't lead to anything, quite simply, but we'll check. There. My opponent doesn't have much time left. He's thinking, I'll speed up this sequence in editing to go straight to the move he played. But you see, you always have to play with these imbalances because, as I've been telling you, there's the imbalance of the bishops. So I'm trying to play on the bishop on the black square. And I'm talking about the structural imbalance with the passed pawn. So I'm trying to promote this passed pawn. You always have to identify the imbalances you have and create plans based on those imbalances. He has to find threats on the white square, since he has the bishop on the white square. He has one more piece than I do to play on the white square, but how can he do it? It's really not easy for him to find threats. He can't destroy this pawn structure without a cost. And so his bishop on the white square is useless. He wasn't able to play it in the game. And there you have it. He resigns. So my opponent starts with e4, I play my pawn, he plays knight to c3, d5, knight to f3, I take on e4, he recaptures, knight to f6. And here, I was expecting him to take the knight. A lot of players do that, and I recapture with the pawn from e7 to f6. The idea is to quickly develop the bishop to castle, and to have a well-sheltered king with 4 pawns for protection, even though I know he has a majority of healthy pawns on the other side of the board. But he doesn't take, and he plays queen to e2. So as a result, I went and took his queen. Above all, I must not play knight to d7 because of the mate on d6. I explained this to you during the game. So I take his knight once, then I bring the other one back. He's going to take the spot. Bishop to c4, knight to f6. He retreats to e2. And here I suppose there are a lot of players who fall into the trap of playing bishop g4. But knight e5 is very strong. You can't take the queen because of bishop. f7 mate. Or even the sacrifice, bishop f7 check, king takes, knight e5 check. And you win back the bishop having gained a pawn. And having forced the black king to lose castling rights. That's why I'm modest in my development. I come to f5, he plays knight to e5. He's threatening bishop on f7 mate. But e6. After all, this move is obvious to play. He does kingside castling, I play bishop to e7. And here notice that I'm not going to take the pawn. c2, it's a trap. First there would be d3, which blocks my bishop's retreat, but there could even be the sacrifice. Knight takes f7, king takes, followed by queen takes on e6 check, and my king goes for a walk. He's forced to go to g6, queen to f7 check. I don't want to go to h6 and g5 under the aim of his bishop. f5, but bishop to e6 check. On the file, the rook attacks. On the black squares, the pawn advances with the bishop for checkmate. I won't take the pawn on c2 and will develop my pieces. After all, that's the problem with my position. I'm not developed enough, so bishop e7. He plays now. c3, I castle. He plays d4. The computer prefers h6 to my move, c5. But in the game, I was happy to play. c5 here, he plays bishop e3, I play. Queen to c7, I connect my rooks just like he does. He plays the rook to d1 and I play the rook to d8. h3 is played, rook to c8, and he plays b3. And here I notice the weakness of the pawn on c3. I mention it during the game, and in the end, it's going to be decisive. So for now, I play pawn to a6 to try to push back his bishop with b5. He plays pawn to a4, and here I look at the attack directly on his pawn on c3 with knight to d5. Actually, the computer prefers that I go to e4. That would have avoided, by the way, a possible exchange of bishop for the knight, which is actually the best choice according to the computer. But my opponent is going to do this, queen h5. He attacks f7, that's true. But bishop g6, so he takes, then we take. And suddenly his queen is pushed back and the pawn c3 will be captured. He comes to f3 because he has an idea anyway. It's to protect the pawn c3 horizontally indirectly. That is to say, when I take the pawn on c3, he will play bishop to f4, attacking my queen and attacking my knight. Fortunately, I have queen a5 to defend. He has bishop d2 to pin me. But pawn takes, and in the end I win a second pawn. And that's when we looked at the move. Queen takes on b7 in the game. He played rook to c1, my opponent, but he could have played something else. Queen takes on b7. And here the computer shows a very amusing variation. After queen takes on b7, it suggests bishop to b4. That obviously I would have found as well. It allows the knight to be unpinned while also protecting it. But what I hadn't yet seen in the game were the consequences. With queen takes on a6, in reality he can't do that. Queen takes on a6. Because I play queen to c7. His rook is still under attack. So he might want to save it. But if he saves his rook, there's rook to a8 and his queen is worth more than 15. Now it's true that he could trade a bishop for a knight. But here I think I can recapture with the c-pawn. And I still have this passed pawn. In reality, we still have the same number of pawns. We have 5 pawns against 5, opposite colored bishop. But my pawn has fighting value, maybe even more important because it's closer to promotion. In any case, the computer gives me a 3-point advantage for black. That's a lot. I'm even surprised that it's that much, but it ultimately considers that the e6 pawn participates in the defense, as does the c3 pawn. It can be an attacking pawn that will destabilize the opponent, and the b3 and a4 pawns are ultimately fixed. These 2 pawns that compensate for my 2 are on white squares, and I have double control over the black squares. He doesn't really have any way to break the situation open. So he can't activate his pawn's majority. As for me, I'm well defended with my pawn structure, my 4 defensive pawns, and it's the c-pawn that can create the imbalance. So I thought that's what he would have done. Queen takes on b7 anyway, but he played rook to c1. So I pushed b5. He captured on c3. I recaptured to get this passed pawn. Bishop to e2. And now, as you've seen in the rest of the game, rook to d2. There's not much to see. Queen b7, queen c7. The exchange of queens is to my advantage. He comes to f3. That's not bad. It's true that if I take his queen, he recaptures with the bishop, and he'll win back a pawn in the process by attacking my rook. But I took on a4. Then I played a5, he played queen b5, x3 attacking the rook, and c2 now. He resigned because he is helpless against the promotion of the pawn. He will have to concede more material losses. I hope this game was interesting. You can leave me likes, comments, share the video as usual, and we'll meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboards. Goodbye, everyone.